a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, me. The Organic Man Coffee Trike is having a special. You give them money, and they give you coffee. Okay, you're actually buying it, so it's not really all that special, but it is special coffee. 4501 McPherson is where the best coffee in the universe can be found and purchased and drank. For those of you too far away, can't drive there or even fly there, you can go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop and get the elixir of the gods. All of these stories that I'm about to go through are from one of my books or another. I talked to all of these folks. I have no reason to think they were lying. They were all just folks I met. If you have an urge to try writing some nonfiction books, first thing you should do is get some business cards. Makes you look like you know what you're doing. Then you can walk up to a total stranger and say, "Have you ever seen a ghost?" Or, "Have you ever seen a UFO?" Or anything like that. And as you're saying this, you hand them your business card. They see the card, they look at you, and they don't, usually, think you're some kind of a nut job. Now, I do get some looks from people, but I get a whole lot of stories as well. There used to be a theater on Santa Maria next to the Kohl's store. Folks would complain to the staff there was a little girl running up and down the aisles during the feature. The staff would say they're going to take care of the problem, but they never went to look. The little girl was the same one seen all over town, and there was no use trying to talk to her because she would simply vanish. The theater burnt down one night, and there was just a big pile of rubble there. I wonder where the little girl went from there, seeing as the Sears store is also closed. Of course, she is seen everywhere. The pile of burnt rubble was surrounded by a fence to keep people out. As I was driving by, I saw a police officer sitting under the shade of a tree, and I figured if I don't ask, I'll never know. I stopped and I asked him if he knew anything about the little girl. He had, and he told me about some of the stories he'd heard from the mall and a couple other places. And then he told me about one of his own experiences. The police have been asked to keep an eye on an old abandoned hospital. Kids try to sneak in and they run around scaring each other and getting into problems. The building is in bad shape and you could get hurt or even worse. Add to the matter, there is asbestos in some of the rooms down in the basement. Like I said, it's an old building. There are also homeless folks and drug dealers and people like that that like to sneak in, and you just might have a bad encounter. The few visits we made with the LPRS were with the permission of the owner. The LPRS also has a few law enforcement members, so we try not to break the law. We have to wind up arresting ourselves. The officer I was talking to had been driving by the building late one night. He pulled into the parking lot to scan around to see if there was any evidence of illegal activity. He spotted a nun standing in one of the windows looking out. At one time, the hospital had been run by the Sisters of Mercy. That's why just about everybody in town still calls it Mercy Hospital, even though it's actually named Laredo Medical Center. Anyway, he thought maybe he'd better check it out since that is his job. He went inside and he looked around, but he didn't see any evidence of anybody inside and he didn't hear anything. So he got back in his unit, ready to go back to work, but he thought, let me just check the video. Sure enough, there was a nun looking out the window at him, dressed in an old style habit. He thought, well, the place is haunted, so he wrote it up as being a ghost. He mentioned this to his girlfriend, who used to work at the hospital back when it was still functioning. She told him about her encounter. She had been in the basement about to take the elevator upstairs. She stepped into the cab and pushed the button for her floor. Just before the doors closed, a nun walked into the cab and stood next to her. The cab suddenly got extremely cold. The elevator moved up to the upper floors. When the door opened, the nun stepped out, and, well, the woman stepped out right behind her. She looked left and right, but the nun had simply vanished. The hallway was empty. She thought about how the nun had been dressed, something out of the 50s or 60s. Over the years, while the hospital was still in business, people would report seeing a nun either in the elevator or on one of the upper floors. The sixth floor of the hospital had a chapel, and it had some rooms where the nuns got to stay. Sometimes the nun seen would be accompanied by a little boy. Other times she'd be alone. Her habit was what caught everyone's attention. It was from the old order that was no longer in the area. Long before trying to become a writer or doing a podcast, I still had an interest in all things paranormal. In basic training at Fort Knox, I would ask folks if they believed in ghosts. Surprisingly, the troops from the northern states said they didn't believe in ghosts. That was just a bunch of nonsense. They only thought crazy people saw ghosts. Most of the folks from the southern states not only believed in ghosts, but they would tell me their ghost stories whenever we had a break. My nephew lives in Virginia. He's had a few sightings of things that can't be explained. He sent me a story, and here it is. This is how he said it to me. I was at the gym on Friday after work. I followed a guy into the locker room to change into my workout outfit. He was in front of me about 6 feet or so. He walked into the locker room and I followed close behind, and he was gone as soon as I entered the room. No one but me. This was broad daylight. One way in and one way out. Just a big open locker area. Nothing. Looked solid, no vapor. He was dressed in all black. I didn't think anything about him until he disappeared. I should have seen him as soon as I opened the door. No weird feelings, so I just went ahead and had my workout. He was dressed in jogging pants, a hoodie. I didn't see his face, and because I was behind him. He looked solid, black, 6'1". He was about as tall as I am. I did note the air seemed a bit cool in the locker room. I just chalked it up as being colder weather. It's amazing how many people I have talked to that tell me that they've had a ghost sighting where the entity looked human. It looked alive until it vanished. Several years ago, Jaime's folks were out of town, so he was doing like a lot of teenage boys. He was going to have a party. They were in the garage having a few drinks and visiting. After a few beers, one of the friends needed the bathroom, and he stepped inside the main house. You do know you don't buy beer, you only rent it. He was gone only a few seconds when he popped back into the garage. He looked shaken. When asked why he'd only been gone a few seconds, the young man said he had run into Jaime's mom in the hallway, and she was in a very revealing outfit. He felt bad seeing his friend's mother, as anyone should. Jaime tried to convince this guy his parents were definitely out of town and there was nobody in the house. The young guy chose to wait until he was at his own home to relieve himself. About a week later, the same young man was over once more and he saw a photograph in a family album. He pointed a finger at the image and said that was who he had seen that night in the hallway. Jaime told him this was a picture of his grandmother, who had been dead for 15 years. After attending the funeral of her grandmother, Nancy went to live in a trailer home on the family property. Her grandfather put his wife's rocking chair in the bedroom that her son was going to use. In the middle of the night, Nancy awoke to the sound of her son crying. She got up and went to see what was wrong. She opened the bedroom door just as her son quit crying. If only it was that easy. She asked him what was wrong, only to be told that he was okay. That woman, he pointed to the rocking chair, had taken care of him. Nancy looked from her son to the chair and back. What woman are you talking about? The boy went on to describe an older woman with gray hair, dressed in a housecoat. Thinking about what the boy had said, she went and got a photograph. She showed it to her son, and he said that was who he had seen. The photo was of Nancy's dead grandmother. Edith was asleep on the couch at her aunt and uncle's house. Her cousin was in the kitchen when he heard her talking in her sleep. He was somewhat amused by this, and so he focused in on what she was saying, kind of eavesdropping on a person talking in their sleep. A different voice began to answer her. There was nobody else in the house besides the two of them, and this other voice definitely was not hers. He peeked around the corner to be sure. Edith was the only one there. This freaked him out a lot, so he stepped out the door. Later, when he told Edith about the incident, she had no memory of anything happening. Her cousin is convinced that she must have been talking to a ghost. People tend to latch on to one location and declare it as their home. On occasion, when having to travel or leave home or whatever reason, they use one of the thousands of hotels or motels to stay for the night, the weekend, and sometimes for a month or two. Once you've checked into a room, it becomes yours until you leave. Some folks use these rented rooms for reasons outside of customary business or society, illegal business arrangements, illicit rendezvous, or maybe just to get away from family and friends. A lot of emotional energy is released inside the building that on occasion becomes infused into the walls or the furnishings. Since energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only changed, what becomes of all of these emotions? A hotel to the north of the Mall del Norte had a few stories about strange things happening there. Michael used to work the night shift as the desk clerk. Part of his duties were to walk outside and check the parking lot for any problems. One night, Michael stepped out the front door. After checking the parking lot, he came back in. There was a picture sitting on a table in the lobby. As he walked by, the picture flipped over onto its face, making a loud crash. The table was stable. There was no reason it should have shook. He didn't even get close to it. There was no wind blowing in through the door. Yet the thing just fell over for no reason. He set it back on its legs and went on to the desk. There was really no reason that it should flip like that. The floor in the lobby is concrete. There's no vibration from walking, and yet the picture just flipped over on its own. He went and he checked the security camera in the lobby. And sure enough, there he is walking by the table. And after he has cleared the table, the picture takes a header onto the tabletop. He showed the footage to his manager, Sherry, and she couldn't figure it out either. The elevator doors in this hotel go up to the third floor and then open and close as if somebody is pushing the call button, but there's nobody waiting for the cab. People in the hotel hear somebody calling them by name. They go looking for the caller only to find there's nobody there and the other staff members are not doing the calling. One desk clerk was called over the radio. She heard her name coming from the device. She answered the call, but nobody responded back. Thinking there might be something going on, she went to ask all the others, also with two-way radios, if they had called for her. Nobody had called, and none of the others had heard her name coming from their radios. There's a shadow being seen walking around the building. One of the staff who has seen the shadow being many times began calling it Bob to make the unknown not quite so scary. Sherry likes to go on ghost hunts up in San Antonio. There are a lot of hotels in the downtown area close to the Alamo, and just about every one of them has some kind of paranormal activity. The closer to the Alamo you get, the more activity. A lot of people don't realize that that building they see, the old church, that's just a very small part of what the Alamo actually was. The thing was huge. Originally built as a mission, San Antonio de Valero, the Alamo first served to Christianize and educate the resident Indians in the 1700s. During the Mexican War of Independence, parts of the mission served as a prison. Between 1806 and 1812, it was the San Antonio Hospital. Anyone passing away was buried in the cemetery that was right next to the mission. A guesstimate is there might be as many as 1,000 bodies in graves that are no longer marked. When you walked around the Alamo, you're walking over somebody's grave. There are hundreds of bodies under the ground where the hotels and stores now sit. In 1835, Santa Anna decided to change all the rules governing Mexico. The people living in northern Coahuila and Tejas had enough and they declared their independence. The mission was expanded into a fort. Walls were built and covering a 5.5 acre area. It was winter time and the weather was cold and wet. Nobody thought that Santa Anna would attack until springtime. Santa Anna, well, he thought different. He cleared out the prisons in Mexico City, putting all the prisoners into uniforms, and then he began to march north. He had between 6,000 and 7,000 men marching 850 miles through the cold, wet, nasty, horrible weather. An untold number of soldiers died during the march, their graves lost to history. The Texans were outnumbered 20-1. The fort was way too big for the number of defenders. It was a one-sided battle. Santa Anna had declared the rebels were pirates, and pirates didn't receive a trial. He had sent word to Washington, but he'd never bothered to tell the Texans. February 23rd, 1836, the Mexican army, consisting of around 4,000 soldiers, arrived and laid siege to the Alamo. The other 3,000 continued on towards Goliad. For 13 days, the Alamo defenders held out, but on morning of March 6th, the Mexican army stormed through the outer walls of the courtyard and overwhelmed the Texas forces. Santa Anna ordered that no prisoners would be taken, and nobody was, as far as we know. There are some stories that perhaps Davy Crockett, who was a Mason, was spared because Santa Anna was also a Mason. But that's another story. The Mexican army suffered heavy casualties. There are believed to be between 600 and 1,600 either killed or seriously wounded. Their bodies were all buried where there is now a park north of the Alamo, near the Children's Hospital. So when your kids are out there playing in the park, they might be playing on top of somebody's grave. That's one of the things about history. The bodies of the Texas fighters were piled up and burned in various locations. Over the years, the walls of the fort were torn down and businesses grew up all around the mission. Many of these buildings are inside the perimeter of the battle site. This could explain why so many people report ghost sightings in hotels in San Antonio. This has led to the number of ghost tours being conducted all around the downtown area. Sherry was hoping to catch some unknown entity on her camera, or at least have a ghost sighting to tell about once back home. She didn't see or hear anything while following the tour guides around the battlefield. Sherry and her friend had a room in the Emily Morgan Hotel. The hotel had originally been a hospital from 1924 until 1984. Laying there asleep in her bed, Sherry heard somebody whispering in her ear. Sherry, Sherry. She thought it was her roommate. Turning on the light, she saw that her roommate was sound asleep. Later that same night, she saw a black shadow walk across the room, passing in front of a huge white wardrobe. The next year, Sherry rented a room at the same hotel, thinking maybe she would see and hear something else. She was not disappointed. At around 2 a.m., a black shadow moved across the room, entering the bathroom. Sherry went to look, and the room was empty. No photographs were taken, no EVPs caught. But it was still a good couple of ghost encounters. That's the problem with most ghost encounters. You're just not ready for it, or when it happens, you're so surprised you don't think I need to get some pictures. The staff working at the Emily Morgan receive phone calls from rooms with nobody in them. The room number comes up on the caller ID, and the rooms are locked and empty. There are images captured by visitors of shadowy shapes on the stairs. People report opening a door to a room only to see somebody sitting on or laying in the bed. The room looks like an older styled hospital room. The image quickly fades and the empty hotel room comes into view. A few visitors have encountered a nurse pushing a trolley along the floor. She walks over to the wall and vanishes through it. Ramiro worked maintenance at this same hotel, the one in Laredo. He used to work at La Posada. The kitchen is underground, down in the lowest floors of the hotel. One night he went down to the kitchen. The light switches were at the bottom of the stairs. He turned the lights on and entered the kitchen. As he was walking across the room, the lights clicked off. They didn't just go poof. He heard the light switch go click. Ramiro had to walk back over to the light switches and flip them back on. Once more, he was almost across the kitchen, and the lights were turned off by some unseen hand. This was just too much, and so he left the basement and found someplace else to work for a bit until the scariness kind of went away. There was a party being held at the San Augustine Ballroom in the lower section of the La Posada. As the night was winding down, the people holding the party told the staff to go ahead and help themselves to whatever was left. As Ramiro was approaching the table, the lights went off. It was extremely dark and there was no sound. When the light came back on, the food had been smeared all over the top of the table and down onto the floor. It had been too quick for anybody to have done such a thing, and there wasn't any sound. Tom lived in Brownsville many years ago. He had managed to rent an apartment which was close to his home, but still he had his own place. One night while laying in bed, he felt a pressure on his chest, as if some heavy object had just been set down on him while he was asleep. You ever heard of the old hag syndrome? He looked around the room, but he saw nothing. Thinking this might be something otherworldly, Tom tried praying. He asked for help from God or any angels that happened to be around. As he lay there praying, An orb appeared next to the bed. It was orange. As he stared at it, faces could be seen looking out from this glowing object. They were staring right at him. This was just too much. Tom jumped out of bed and ran for the front door. He opened it and ran out as fast as possible. When he got to the end of the walkway, he turned and he looked back. In the window were the same faces that he had seen in the orb. They were all looking out the window right at him. Tom was so shook up, he ran for his parents' house. It was only a couple of blocks, but he only had on his underwear. He got to the house and he had to pound on the door since he didn't have his key. His dad opened the door and was somewhat surprised to find his son in nothing but his underthingies. The next morning, Tom and his dad drove over to the apartment to collect his things, cancel his contract, and to move back home. George, not his real name, was in Iraq along with his company. They were stationed in an old town built more like a fort. They were walls running around the four sides. If you ever watched the old Warner Brother cartoons, I believe it was Pepe Le Pew would always tell the black and white cat that he was going to take her to the Casbah. A Casbah was a walled city in that part of the world. George was doing one of his many duties, which is guarding the perimeter. Each and every night, all night long, somebody had to stay up and keep an eye out for any activity that might need dealing with. As he walked along the wall, sounds began to come from the desert. They were very soft at first, but they began to build over the next few minutes. George stood in place and he tried to see or hear anything that might need alerting the rest of his unit. The activity kept growing louder, and soon he could make out the sounds of fighting. There were yells and screams, what could only be described as horses galloping across the land, just far enough away to be masked by the darkness. George could hear steel hitting steel, sword battle taking place. The fighting went on for several minutes, never getting any closer. Things going on that far from the wall were not sufficient reason to wake the rest of the unit. Long days and short nights interrupted by guard duty and an occasional firefight meant sleep was not to be interrupted for just any sounds in the night. Gradually, the sounds of fighting grew quiet, followed by silence. It was now way too quiet outside the walls. Eventually, everything got back to normal. The night became just darkness, and George got back to walking the perimeter, looking for any real trouble. The next day, he was curious about what he had heard, and he finally asked one of the guys who had been in town longer than him. He asked the squad sergeant if anyone had ever reported any weird sounds outside the wall. The sergeant laughed and said, "You heard the battle out there in the dark, huh?" It turned out just about everybody on guard duty late at night was treated to a late night encounter. Hundreds of years ago, a huge battle had taken place where the sounds could be heard coming from. Hundreds, if not thousands of men had died fighting one of the many battles that had been fought over this part of the world. Now it would seem the ghosts of the long dead are still trying to claim this part of the world. Jason was a member of the National Guard. He and his wife were looking for a place to either buy or rent, something not too expensive. They found a house in the Oak Ridge neighborhood, uh, on the northeast side of town. The house was in good shape and the rent was reasonable. In fact, it was a lot cheaper than any of the other houses they had looked at so far. The former owner had been a high ranking officer at the airbase back when it was still open. He and his wife had lived there for several years. When the house came on the market, several families had moved in, only to move back out within a few months. Nobody wanted to stay, even with the low rent. Jason and his wife moved in and they got settled. They were only there a few weeks when tensions began to mount. Any little thing might lead to an argument. They both began to look for the least little thing the other did as an affront. Arguing became a normal thing each day. Over the next year and a half, the couple became more like two people sharing a house than a couple. Jason's dad would help out around the house. He would drop by from time to time to fix anything that was broken or maybe just to mow the lawn. He wanted to help keep his family together, despite what was slowly happening to them. One day, while working in the yard, Jason's dad saw an older woman open the door and then stand there watching him. He thought this must have been his daughter in law's mother or maybe an aunt. The woman finally invited him inside to cool off. Sitting in the living room, the man noted this woman looked nothing like his daughter in law. She looked like she had come from a distant time back when people dressed and acted a lot differently. As they talked, the woman told the man she had died in this very house many years ago. Her and her husband had lived there back when her husband had run the airbase. She said her husband was also now dead, but she never said if he had died in the house as well. The dad was shocked by what this woman was saying. He couldn't believe he was actually talking to a ghost. He kept trying to convince himself he was just being joked with. This lasted right up until the woman vanished from sight. The dad now had an unbelievable story. He'd not only seen a ghost, he'd had a conversation with one. She had looked just like any living, breathing person. Later, an old photograph was found. It wasn't anything special, so they just threw it away. The photo reappeared. Even when torn to pieces and thrown in the trash can, the next few days would go by and the photo would be back on the counter. It didn't show anyone of interest or any scene from around the house. Eventually, the couple did get a divorce and they moved away from the house. Before moving in, they had never argued about anything. It was only once they were in the house that things began to fall apart. Tony and his wife lived in Miami, Florida, a few years ago. Their house was on the side of a small hill, which did give them a nice view. Tony had collection of bottles, some of which sat in the kitchen window. He liked the way they looked, so he took a photo of them. Once the image was stored in his cell phone, he showed it to his wife. In the photo, looking in from outside, was a woman. She was looking right at him as he took the photo. His wife was not pleased by this image. The window is 8 feet off the ground. This woman could not have been real. There was no way she could have been standing there looking in. The photo creeped her out so badly she insisted he delete it from his phone. Tony did as asked. Then he began to inquire around the neighborhood if anybody knew who this woman might have been. It turned out a woman matching this description had been killed in a hit and run accident right out front of the house. The couple eventually moved to Edinburgh, Texas, and into a new home, and that's where I met them. Once more, while taking pictures around the house, Tony caught something bizarre. Not in the window, but in the curtains behind the window or beside. He could see somebody looking out from inside the curtains. As he zoomed in, he said that the face looked like Linda Blair from the movie The Exorcist. He showed me the photo, and I think it looked like her as well. Once again, his wife was not happy, knowing there might be something in their house besides them, something they don't seem able to get rid of. April 2018, I was at the Edinburgh UFO Festival. I was given a vendor's table right next to Travis Walton. I managed to talk to Travis quite a bit whenever there was a break in the visitors. In fact, he was on the show a couple of years ago. In fact, I think it was in 2018 as well. Very nice man. Very tall. And boy, does he have red hair. A man had just stepped up to my table to buy one of my books. He had gotten the Laredo Paranormal Research Society for his sister, who lived in Laredo. While we're standing there, he began to tell me about his grandfather's ghost sighting from back in the 40s. Somebody came up to my table and asked me a question, and before I could get the original man's name, he waved and walked away. The next week, I was doing my podcast, this one I'm doing right now, and I announced that I really would like to talk to this man with the ghost story from El, not El Cenizo, from San Ignacio, and I wanted to know how that story ended. My wife is a school teacher, and she was approached at work by one of her coworkers who asked if just maybe she somehow knew of a writer with the same last name. She had just gotten a book from her brother called the Laredo Paranormal Research Society. Angie is Joe's sister, the guy from Edinburgh who had started telling me the ghost story. There's something really weird about coincidences. We wound up having dinner with Angie and her parents. They told us a lot of stories from San Ignacio, Fort Ringgold, and from Laredo. Joe Solis was the man telling me the story about his grandfather, and here it is. And now for the rest of the story. Back in the 40s, people living in San Ignacio didn't have plumbing. If you needed the facilities, you had to walk out the back door and use that little building at the far end of the yard. You always put the outhouse as far away as possible because in the summertime, the smell got somewhat unpleasant. At night, it was necessary to use a kerosene lantern to light the way. The outhouse was out back of the yard, past the corrals and the pigeon coop. The grandfather would tell the family there was a headless ghost that would follow him as he was walking out to the outhouse or returning. The ghost would come from the corrals. He was not so much scared as tired of seeing this specter. The family figured the old guy was just imagining things. It was dark, and using a lantern outside could create some scary shadows. Maybe he was just imagining things. After years of hearing this story about the headless ghost, the family just mostly ignored him. The grandfather died in 1959. In 1997 or maybe 99, a fence was being built along the area where the corrals and the pigeon coop used to be. The workers digging the fence posts when they found bones buried in the yard, human bones. The crew unearthed an old yellow skeleton that was missing its head. A search of the records in town did not produce any information on who had been buried there. It was assumed the body may have been an Indian who had died and was buried before the house was even there. His head was never found. San Ignacio is an old town that has a lot of history. On the corner of Uribe and Gutierrez Street in the 19th century fortified complex known as the Trevino Uribe Ranch. Folks also call it the fort. It was built on a bluff overlooking the Rio Grande River back in the 1830s. As time went by, the fort became known as Fort Trevino. It was actually a fortified ranch house used to defend the rancher and his family during bandit raids from Mexico. The entire fort is 100 feet by 140 feet. It was built using hand-cut sandstone blocks with a wooden roof. The community had been slated to be destroyed in the name of progress, but once the Falcon Dam was built in 1951, the town was saved. Joe's sister and parents told me these next few stories. I put Angie down as the one speaking because as I was writing my notes, I didn't bother to take down whose name told me which story. So she gets credit for everything. The same grandfather from the headless ghost story had told about when he was young. He used to be harassed by a little girl in a white dress. She wasn't any ordinary little girl because she moved about as if being able to appear and disappear at will. He would be out playing in the yard. This meant the entire area around the house. If he needed to go back into the house, he would walk up to the back gate. The little girl would appear and block his entrance. Not wanting to deal with anything supernatural, he would run to the front gate only to run into her there as well. She didn't run to the front gate, she just appeared there as he approached. The townsfolk all avoided the area west of the house. There was a huge black dog that nobody knew who owned it or where it had come from, but it would stand there and growl, making people very uncomfortable. The old fort had a hitching post out front for tying up horses. A 4-year-old girl told her folks that she didn't want to go near the corrals because there was a man sitting on a horse. He had glowing red eyes that scared her. Angie did not like standing on the ground in the plaza. There were picnic tables and benches to sit on, but the ground felt wrong. It would cause her entire body to shake. She would ride her bike through the area or sit on one of the benches or tables with no problem. Once her feet touched the dirt, things got weird. She felt as if she were being watched by unseen strangers. The house they lived in was an old cabin, a block and a half from the fort that had been added to over the years. As generations would come and go, rooms would be built or torn down or replaced. This caused the house to kind of move about the property over the years. At night, they could hear somebody walking along the wooden floors of the hallway. On occasion, they would hear dishes crashing to the floor in the dining room. In the morning, the dining room would be undisturbed. Nothing was out of place. On occasion, the door to rooms would be held shut by some unknown entity. I've heard about others who have had this happen to them. A door that opens and closes without any problem suddenly refuses to budge. Or there's no locking device, but the doorknob won't turn, as if being held by some ghostly hand. One night it sounded as if somebody were beating on the front door to their house. They saw somebody looking in through the window. By morning, everything would be back to normal. Angie grew up and became a music teacher. She was hired as the assistant band director in Rio Grande City, 70 miles south from her home. Rio Grande City High School was located on old Fort Ringgold. Many of the buildings were from back when this was an active military base. The music class was in the officers' pay building from the 1890s. The building had been boarded up to safeguard the musical instruments kept on hand for the students. In the summertime, it would get very hot and uncomfortable in the building, but that's a part of living in Texas. Angie was sitting with her back to the blackboard talking to the students. How many of y'all were ever taught in a classroom with a blackboard? You would write on it with a piece of chalk, and then you'd have to erase it and get chalk dust everywhere that made people sneeze. Angie heard the doorknob rattling as if somebody were turning it. These were the old-fashioned doorknobs that sat in the door using a square rod that would loosen over the years. The knob rattled, and then the door swung open. It then swung shut. There was nobody in the hallway, nobody at the doorway, and nobody could have opened and closed the door without being seen. The students all looked at the door, and then they looked at the teacher. As the teacher, you're expected to be in control no matter what. Angie wanted to run, but she acted as if this was just a normal occurrence. Nothing to see here. She just went on teaching. In her mind, she was wondering, what in the world is going on around here? The band director was talking to the class one day. They were in the main room, which had a carpeted stage for the percussion instruments. As he was talking, the cymbal crashed to the floor. The director thought one of the students was messing around, but Angie was between the entire class and the stage. There was no way anyone could have snuck onto the stage, dropped the cymbal without being seen. One day, as they were talking in the office, they could hear people talking from the back room. The director went to see who was in there. He opened the door and looked in, shut the door, and then said, "Let's get out of here." The back room was empty. When they were outside, he told Angie he had opened the door and turned on the lights. As the lights came on, the voices stopped. When he flipped the switch, turning the lights back off, the voices started up again. It kind of freaked him out a lot. These days, everyone has a camera with them at all times. Cell phones can be a handy tool if you use them right and stop letting your life be glued to the screen. You see people walking down the street with cell phone right in front of their face. They step right out in front of cars. They don't even know that things are going on around them. The band director had brought a camera to the fort to take some pictures of some of the old buildings around the place. The main gate has a guard shack, a small building for the security guard to get in out of the sun. The guard was leaning against the building in what sounded like a comical stance. The director thought this would make a neat photo, so he clicked off 3 shots. When the photos were developed, the image of the guard did look somewhat humorous. The first photo, it was just the guard leaning against the building. The second photo, there was a second figure standing at attention, and near the guard shack was a man in a cavalry uniform. He looked as if he took his job seriously. The soldier was there, but you could see the ground beyond him. He was not in the third photo. Robert E. Lee had passed through the area back in 1850s. He'd been a general in the Union Army, and he was going from fort to fort along the river. Having a distinguished visitor at the fort, the building he stayed in was named after him. One of the students walking across the complex looked up and saw the building was on fire. Flames and smoke billowed from the old wooden structure. He ran to sound the alarm. When people came running, the building was just sitting there, inside its fence. No smoke, no flames. The kid might have been hallucinating, but nobody that talked to him thought he had imagined things. He had seen fire and smoke. He swore to it. People would report seeing a man in an old cavalry uniform trying to enter one of the buildings. He would step up to the door and grab the knob. Sometimes they could hear the doorknob shaking in his hand. The sousaphones, I call those tubas, were hanging from hooks on the wall. They began to swing back and forth. The teacher, seeing this happen, said, "Stop that." The tubas all stopped swinging and they went back to just hanging there. I guess she had dealt with these ghosts before. The custodian was described as being a big guy. He looked more like a linebacker from a football team than a workman who'd push a broom. One morning, he asked, "Where were the batteries?" "What batteries?" he was asked. He said the batteries to the bells. The bells were musical instruments used by the marching band. These are mechanical, no electronics needed. When he was told the bells didn't use batteries, he said the things had been playing by themselves. He then quit, not wanting to deal with ghosts playing music at night. George and Lisa moved to a new home in November 2021. There was a bedroom called the master suite that just wasn't what they were looking for. So they moved their things into the middle bedroom. They put a bed in the other room to be used as a guest room. George was putting some things in the guest room closet when he noticed an indentation on the blanket on the bed. It looked like a big black dog had been sleeping there. George thought maybe it was his puppy, Ralph, who weighed about 75 pounds. George smoothed out the blanket and went on about his business. A few days later, the indentations were back. There were the imprints of something using the bed, but there was no dog hair on the blanket. At about 3 a.m., George was stepping out of the bathroom when he saw a huge dog walk out of the guest room. At first, he thought it was Ralph. The black dog walked across the hallway and through the door leading to the backyard. The door was closed and locked. How did the dog get out of the house? George found Ralph asleep in his bedroom. This has led George to believe there's a ghost dog living, or rather residing, in their new home. Recently, George got back with me to say he saw the black dog once again. It walked across the hall and right through the wall. He thinks there may have been a door there at one time, and then the house was remodeled. He frequently finds indentations on the bed in the spare room, like a large dog has been laying there. Smoothing it out, sometimes later, the indentations will reappear. A friend of his suggested he put some security cameras around the house in places where the dog has been seen. George is concerned he might see something that might make his home less desirable to live in. Big Ralph doesn't seem to ever notice the ghost dog. League City, the town is my hometown. We had a tiny one-room bedroom house. One room. Try that again. League City is my hometown. We had a tiny one-bedroom house in the country that soon became a three-bedroom, two-story house. Now it's just an empty lot. Bob was renting a house out by the airfield that used to be on Highway 96. There were three houses set side by side, all built at around the same time. They all kind of looked the same, too. The house he was living in was haunted. His name was actually Bob. I didn't have to give him that name. Bob said it wasn't spooky or unsettling. It was annoying. He would be all alone in the house, step into the bathroom, close the door, sit down to do his business. As he sat there, the door would swing open. Bob would finish up and he would check the door. There's no reason that the door should simply swing open like that. The next time he closed the door and he locked it, pulled on the door to be sure it was secured, sat down. Once again, the door swung open. It got to a point that Bob just left the door open. In the kitchen, things would get moved. Bob would get a glass down from the cabinet, set it on the counter. Open the refrigerator, he would get out the iced tea pitcher and turn to the counter. The glass would be gone. Bob would find it back in the cabinet or in the sink, and sometimes it would be in the refrigerator. The bedroom door would open and close on its own. His wife was scared by this activity until she got used to it. Car keys, wallets, purses would vanish, necessitating a search before going to work each and every day. Just getting out the door in the morning was an ordeal. After putting up with this weird activity for months, they decided to move. Once away from that house, things went back to normal. The houses, along with the airfield, are no longer there. They were replaced by a housing development. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell others they should be listening. If you didn't enjoy the show, why are you still listening? If you have a story you'd like to share with me or the public, you can send it to me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Until next week, This is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where there's strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.